Class is in session. Hey everybody, and welcome to Unlearn 16. Class is in session. Today you just get me all by my lonesome in my new closet / podcast room. If you can't see the closet, well, you're going to have to go check out my last TikTok, Hey Team Anapac Vlogs. That's how we redid the whole room. Today I'm going to talk about something controversial. And you know what? I've avoided it for a while for a couple reasons, but now I feel like I can't anymore because there's so much hypocrisy, my head wants to explode. And that is about trans athletes. I'm done with it. I'm done with all of the right-wing, absolute asinine attacks for a whole bunch of reasons. So let's go to the Olympics for a second and speak about Imane, the boxer from Algeria, who is winning, who everybody is making claims that she is a man and she is trans and she is winning all of these things because obviously she snuck in there. It's like nobody actually wants to read anything, understand anything. And to be perfectly honest, the reason why I'm not going to speak on her to such a huge extent is because I am not going to claim to know specifically until I hear it from her mouth what the parameters are of her levels of testosterone, her whatever. But let's be clear. The Olympic Committee and the Olympics have determined that she is competing as a woman in the Olympics under fair and justifiable legality. And that's all I need to know. Does she hit hard? Yeah. Yes, she does. But here's the funny part. This is an individual who was born a woman, who lived her whole life as a woman, and the right or elements are now stipulating that, well, obviously she's been hiding it her whole life. And she was actually born a man and she's hiding it and she snuck in to compete and to win at boxing. And guys, my head, and she has this advantage. And a lot of people are talking about the fact that she has elevated levels of testosterone. Well, some athletes do. Which brings me to the point where, and the reason why I'm so frustrated, and I'm not even, I feel like sometimes I get this frustrated. I don't often speak on an issue because it's so enraging. I find it difficult to be articulate. So let me try to take a deep breath and really dive in. We want to create a system of athletics in which there is fair and just competition. I understand that. I absolutely understand that. But I'm going to side with Neil deGrasse Tyson here and stipulate that maybe, just maybe, that the binary of the sexes that we have created and applied to sport is not necessarily the best way to categorize levels of athletes. Because when people started arguing about trans athletics, I would be very, very clear. I mean, I've always said, let them play. I've also said I'm not an endocrinologist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a medical professional. I am not trans. I am not family if somebody is trans. I just want to see people being included as the driving force in our society, because I'm going to stand by the idea that fewer people get harmed when we are inclusive than not. Then people started talking about, okay, well, it's all about estrogen and testosterone levels. Okay, all right. So what did people in the trans community do? Well, they ensured that their estrogen and testosterone levels were in the pre-described, I guess, categorized limits. I would expect there be a lower and an upper limit in order to fairly compete in each event. Well, then people are like, well, that's not good enough. That's not good enough. Because if individuals went through puberty, specifically as males going through puberty and then transitioned into a woman, that they would have all these other advantages, nothing to do with testosterone: muscle mass, bone density, height, wingspan, right? Everybody talked about this with Leah Thomas. Wingspan, the ability of oxygenation of red blood cells in order to do all of these different athletic things. Listen, and here's what they did, in my opinion. As people started really talking about those issues and really stipulating the advantages of those different issues that were given to different people. By the way, not all cisborn men, not all cisborn women, but some. And I took a step back and went, maybe, just maybe, we aren't correctly identifying an even or a relatively even playing field for individuals to compete on. Let's look. Let's take it out of trans athletes for a second. Let's not talk about trans athletes. Let me just talk about me. All right? I'm 5'6". Putting on muscle mass, relatively difficult. I don't have a particularly high level of testosterone at a naturally occurring state. I don't have, the fast twitch muscle fibers that cause people to be able to have great sprinting or jumping capacities. I wasn't born with that. And yet, I, in my life, had competed against cisborn women that have stood 6'2", 6'3" above me. They put on muscle mass in an incredible way. They have higher levels of naturally occurring testosterone. They have the ability to jump and sprint at a much higher rate than I do. They were naturally born with these things. Why am I competing against those individuals? No matter how hard I bust my butt, I'm never getting close. Now, if that's the case, should we not maybe have more of a wide variant factorization going into how we section off athletics? And none of this is to mention the horrific levels of sexism that have gone on in sport forever. Women weren't allowed to ski jump. Want to know why? Doctor said our uterus would fall out. I wish I was making that up. There are events historically that women were taken out of because they didn't like it that they beat men. Whoop. I am exhausted at the way in which we then weaponize, or some people then weaponize, this idea of naturally born aptitudes and how we should categorize them when they have zero understanding of the huge dynamic, the wide ranging of dynamic that can go into giving an athlete undue natural advantages in comparison to the other field of athletes, right? So for Imane, the Algerian boxer, there has been talk. I have no idea if it's true because heaven help me, finding the truth on the internet is really mission impossible without Tom Cruise. Potentially, this individual, and I say that, has a Y chromosome, but has presented as female their entire life. Female genitalia, female development, female across the board. Doctor identified her as a female, has this extra chromosome or has a Y chromosome, which is completely possible. So when people talk about you're either XX or XY, they don't know what they're talking about because there are about 8 variances when it comes to chromosomal realities about sex variants. Okay? We're not we're not two sexes, we're bimodal. Rather than divided so clear cut into 2 categories. So an extra chromosome, or I think it's called Swyer syndrome, this extra Y chromosome, which gives the individual, who is still, by the way, scientifically categorized as a female, higher levels of testosterone. And from what I understand, in some cases, they are unable to necessarily reproduce because they lack ovaries, yet they can still carry a baby to term if an egg was implanted in their uterus. Does that sound confusing? Yeah, it does. That's okay. We've been so far living in this land of the simplistic that the more information we get, it's like we want to disavow it meaning anything or having any relevance whatsoever. So rather, as Neil deGrasse Tyson so eloquently put it, rather than taking a new perspective and stepping back from the old ways of judgment and classification, maybe it's time, since we know more, to classify differently and more justly and more fairly. Because all of those people said there's only two. And all of a sudden, when this individual presents themselves and possibly shows this chromosomal variant, all of a sudden, there's not only two. All of a sudden, the scientific classification of classifying her as a woman as she was born doesn't count anymore. Why? Because she can hit really hard? We need to really take a step back and understand how this entire new, not perspective, but new scientific information actually plays into how do we set up a fair and just way of people competing against one another in athletic competition. Maybe that's the time we start using our heads just a little more than we used to. Maybe, just maybe, we start to understand that the perceptions and the understanding of sex in 1952 might be perhaps just a little more technically incredible as of today because we understand things better. Possibly. Right? But nobody wants to do that. What do they want to do? Well, they want to weaponize it. They want to use it to divide. They wanted to use it to elevate levels of hatred and animosity and anger in order to do what? I mean, I have never seen more individuals that have never spoken about women's sports in their entire life speak about protecting women's sports. Those same individuals would have stood against Title IX. Those same individuals would talk about how women right now don't deserve the same funding model in the WNBA. By the by, side note, everybody talking about the WNBA as though they were demanding the same pay scale as LeBron and all of the rest in the NBA have never actually listened ever. What they were saying was they want the same percentages. So if the NBA makes $1 million and LeBron makes 20%, great. The top player in the WNBA should be making 20%. WNBA players don't make any money off their jerseys. They don't make any extra sort of out-of-pocket money on anything. All they were demanding is an equitable distribution of the money, not equal. And I know all of you guys don't understand, or some of the people on the right don't understand the difference between equity and equality. They are not asking for the same. They are asking for a fair percentage that is equitable to the percentages that are given in the NBA. Where's all the heart and spirit, if you love women's sports, about that? That's what I want to know. So when I think about, I'm watching the Olympics and we watch the opening ceremonies, and I've spoken about that a little bit and spoken about how everybody turned it into some ridiculous attack on religious belief and structure, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I'm not going to talk about the Feast of Dionysus because you know what? I didn't know anything about the Feast of Dionysus before the Olympics. But you know what I did? And it's going to blow a lot of people's minds. I looked it up. The elements of French culture that I actually understood, of course they were going to push the envelope. Of course they were going to. They're an expressive, culturally divergent, very, they're going to push the borders at every place they possibly can push. Have at it. Have you ever seen the Moulin Rouge? Obviously not. It's absolutely ridiculous. So, what I want to understand is if we are looking to support athletes, if we are looking to support people experiencing the very best they have to offer, why would we not want a system in which it encourages, supports, and elevates those individuals no matter what? By the way, the boxing league that Imane came out of, and this whole, she was pulled out of a fight, or she was pulled out of the league and lost a title in one of the. This league, from what I understand, is one of the most corrupt, broken leagues that is very heavily led by one or two countries who get to puppeteer who wins, who gets kicked out, who gets persecuted, and who moves on, to the point where the Olympic Committee is at a point where they're not going to possibly have boxing anymore because they cannot place any value or any credibility in the league doing its job to bring the best of the best to the Olympics without prejudice and without bias. This is the people we want to listen to? All of this is saying, listen, I think we just need to figure out how we can better address, classify, how we can apply this knowledge we have to sport in order to make it doesn't, we want it to be inclusive, sure. Do I want to see the best of the best? Sure. But when I say it's the best of the best, am I allowing, and I know Michael Phelps has a laundry list of things he is great at, exceptionality in his physical, naturally born makeup. He's double jointed, he has extra bones. I think the guy has gills. I don't think it's fair. Are we going to then start acknowledging all of that? And what is the difference? What is the difference between Michael Phelps and all of his genetically born predispositions in order to be a great swimmer and the average guy, cis-born man? I want to know what that difference is. Because if that difference is any less or any more different than what we're talking about when we're talking about trans athletes competing on the highest of athletic scale, I have a problem with that. I have a problem with that because then you're not arguing about what's fair and just. You're arguing about what's fair and just as it pertains to your own very specific delineation of the way the world's supposed to work. The reason why I didn't want to necessarily go down this lane was because I'm not trans. I'm not an expert. But I think there's a rational conversation that needs to be had. A rational conversation that says, we are all interested, if we are at all, we are all interested in figuring out how to have the right groupings of individuals strive for top positions based on a just and equitable application model of naturally born capacity. And if that's our goal, maybe, just maybe, let's have a conversation that we haven't gotten 100% right. There's that basketball player that's like 7'8". Stop it. Stop it. My dude, just have to stand, step out of the key, step in the key, grab the ball, dunk the ball, have a nice day. What? And if your argument is, well, he was just born with it, and that's okay to have that variance involved, then your argument falls flat when we're talking about the trans community. It really does. And it really falls flat when you think, because this is the ridiculous assumption that men are going to transition into women just so they can win at what? The butterfly stroke? Stop it. Stop it. Maybe if we would have treated our female athletes well over the last 100 years, we didn't keep them out of sport, we didn't make different rules for them, we didn't create different games for them. Have you ever listened? I don't know how many people know the differences between ringette and hockey, but if you want to explode your head and you want to see sexism in real time as the creation of those two sports exist, guys, I promise you don't want any of that smoke. It's ridiculous. I'm just going to tell you one rule. Ringette, since for women, it's a sport of passing. It's a team sport. So they actually put in rules about how many times you have to pass before you're allowed to attempt to score. What? What? This is all a part of the way that we socialize and we grow and we manipulate and we shape young girls and boys. It's so funny. It's so funny that we create such distinct categories between the two and then are shocked when people find their entire identity existing in the acknowledgement of existing in one of those two categories. It's not surprising. It makes perfect sense. And if anybody was willing to have a rational conversation about this, it would be very, very, very different. If anybody was willing to sit down and say, okay, how do we make, what's our goal? What's our goal in professional athletics? What do we want out of it? Because if we could agree on that, if we could agree on what we want out of it, then the methodology for the way in which we wanted to create and we wanted to encourage and we wanted to empower young individuals to strive to be great would be very different. And there wouldn't be these arguments and this rage and this call to violence. It wouldn't exist. Choking on my own words. You know, and we've seen this. We've seen this in our treatment of different athletes. Alonia, I can't remember her last name. She's an incredible sevens rugby player for the women's side of the United States. The woman runs a 100-meter sprint 1 second behind world record holders. She is one of the most physically dominating, powerful athletes I've ever seen. Incredible shoulders, incredible strength. Her whole life, people have called her fat. People have talked about her weight. People have demeaned her physicality because she's not a real woman. What is the matter with everybody? You're all bent on cis-born women. Those are the only people that can compete. And when a cis-born woman shows strength and power to a level that just makes you uncomfortable, Well, all over the internet, she's being called a man, demonized. She's calls to violence have been perpetrated against her all over the place. Why? Because she's that strong? Because she's that powerful? What are we doing? It's as though we want our female athletes the way they wanted to construct them in 1952, playing soft sports with dulcet tones in their voice and not getting too competitive and not getting too muscular and not being too loud about it, because we just want to keep you laughing and flowing. And if you want to hit a tennis racket around and just, but heaven forbid you're competitive. Heaven forbid you show a level of determination and aggression, an individualistic kind of empowered, non-stop attack of competing at your sport and winning. Heaven forbid. Because as soon as you're that, you can't even be a woman anymore, because the woman category has been so clearly defined and limited. Gross. What a waste. Now, I am not saying there shouldn't be limits. I am not saying there shouldn't be safety parameters. I am not saying there shouldn't be weight classes and divisions made so people don't get injured and don't get hurt. Of course. In my head, I could still play rugby 7. If I stood up against Alonia, I would be a squished pancake, with a memory of when I used to be able to hold a rugby ball and run down the field. She would hit me so hard that I would forget that I even was a rugby player. I shouldn't be competing against her. Now, some people would say, yeah, but Joanna, if you train to that degree, right? Yeah, well, I understand that that's possible, but let's also understand that I could train as hard as she did, and there could be natural advantages that individuals have, and I have no problems with those natural advantages, to be honest with you. I have other natural advantages. I have really good hair. There's not a sport for that yet, but I'm sure one day there will be. It is to acknowledge the natural advantages, but not just categorize them male and female, A, B, line 1, line 2, because life is more complicated than that. Society is more complicated than that. Understanding greatness is more complicated than that. And the minute we can start to understand that and embrace that, that's the day we can actually start to build something much more practical and impressive and magical than ever before. But if you want to stick your head in the sand and say everything's black and white, everything's right and wrong, please go left, please go right, there's only two, a binary is the way it's always existed from here to eternity, well, my friends, you are living in a fictitious world where simplicity reigns supreme because you're not ready for the truth. And I was under the impression that your side was all about facts over feelings. Having said that, I hope I didn't hurt your feelings too much in this episode, but I will see you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Dismissed.